I'm going to go ahead and start the recording. So let's get started. So first, good morning, everyone. Before we begin, I would like to thank Ms. Ada Ramirez for providing Spanish translation for today's session. There is no default language, so everyone needs to please click on the interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen. It's that little globe icon, and select either English or Spanish. For those who don't know me, my name is Samantha Wiley, and I'm the Convention Coordinator for the Episcopal Diocese of Los Angeles. Welcome to our virtual ministry fair, Servants of the Spirit, Gifts for Ministry. We are joined today with epidemiologist Dr. Nina Harawa about the benefits, safety, and efficacy of the COVID-19 vaccines. We are also joined by Canon Dr. Steve Nishibayashi, retired pediatrician and EDLA's very own Secretary of Convention. As a reminder, the session is being recorded. I'm going to see if I can get our live stream set up while we're going, but for right now, it is being recorded. And that video will be available for viewing on demand later. A link will be available at www.diocesanconvention.com. At this time, I ask everyone to mute yourselves, but we would love to hear from you during today's session. Anytime you have a question or comment, please put it in the chat and we'll pause throughout the presentation to answer them in the order asked. At times, Dr. Harawa might have a question for you all as well, and we invite you to raise your digital hand to speak. You can find the raise hand function in the participants window, which you can get to from the bottom of your screen. So I'm going to go ahead and start. Dr. Harawa, would you like me to launch the poll? All right, so I'm going to go ahead and launch a poll as we begin here. And I'm going to turn it to Deacon Joanne. Actually, Bishop Diane, would you be up for offering an opening prayer and maybe a remark about today's session?
Yes, the Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Gracious and Holy One, we give you thanks for this day. We give you thanks for the gifts that people have been given, especially the gifts of healing. We are very grateful today, Lord, to have Nina and Steve with us, as well as Joanne. Lord, we ask you to open our minds and hearts to hear and discern your will for us. And may we be agents of change and peace and health and healing for this world. All this we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. And I'm just very grateful to see everyone this morning. And Dr. Harawa and Dr. Nishibayashi and Dr. Leslie. It is just wonderful to have you doing this for us. And to know that it's going to be recorded and we can watch it again or send it to someone that needs to watch it. So I'm just very grateful to be with you all. So, and thank you, and take it away.
All right, thank you. Deacon Joanne, would you like to introduce our speakers this morning?
I certainly would. I'm really thrilled that we're having this workshop. It's a dream of mine that the diocese can play a role in helping ensure that everybody get vaccinated as easily and quickly as possible. And this is part of that effort. I'm really pleased to introduce my friend and public health colleague, Dr. Nina Harawa. She's a professor of epidemiology at both UCLA and the Charles R. Drew University of Medicine and Science. Much of Nina's research involves partnering with local government and community organizations to address health disparities. Historically, her work has focused a lot on HIV/AIDS, especially ways to encourage men leaving jail to access and use effective treatments. So it was a very natural pivot this past year for Nina to take on a leadership role in reaching out to underserved communities and to the African-American community to ensure that they were getting accurate information about COVID-19 and now more recently about the COVID-19 vaccine. In addition to her busy life as an epidemiologist and public health professional, Nina has two beautiful daughters and she teaches Sunday school at Holy Faith Church in Inglewood. Thank you for coming, Nina.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here. And thank you for honoring the role that our faith communities have in helping people understand both a very challenging year that we've had and putting into perspective, but also understanding the public health measures and other things that are available that will hopefully get us out of this particular pandemic. I have a brief question if somebody in the audience would be willing to just come off their mics for 1 second and respond. And my question for you is, what made you if somebody could share what made you interested in learning a little bit more about the vaccines? Is there something particularly that you would like to get out of today? It's always helpful for me if I can interact a little bit with the audience in this virtual space.
So if everyone has a comment, go ahead and raise your digital hand. That's in the participants window. I'll be able to see that. And we also have the poll in progress if you'd like to answer that for those who have not been vaccinated. Yes, Deacon Keith, go ahead and unmute yourself. Would love to hear from you.
Okay, there we go. I'm just thinking that as someone interested in healthcare for a long time now, beginning with the HIV crisis in the 80s and going all the way through all the other pandemics, this is an opportunity in which we have a vaccine for a very major illness. It's not, of course, the only such vaccine. So I think it's important for me to know when I'm talking to people as I go about the world, as deacons do, to be able to tell them good, correct information about the vaccines. I think I know a lot about it, but things are changing every day. So that's basically it.
All right, thank you so much. Jamesetta, if you could go ahead and unmute yourself, we'd love to hear from you.
Good morning, it's James Etta. You call me Jamie if you like. I have had both vaccines, but I have family members in the younger generation who are not willing to take the vaccine, and also have family members who are of a different denomination that does not receive blood transfers or transfusions. So want to know a little bit about how to respond to them as I have decided to do my vaccines, but just how to respond to them in a kind and loving way.
All right, thank you very much. I've also received a couple of messages. I would like to know which vaccine would be best for someone with ITP and has no spleen or other comorbidities. Another question someone has for today: when will the EUA end and actual FDA approval be granted to vaccines? So those are a couple other questions that we've got for today's session. So we also have that poll. We have 12 responses. Nina, would you like me to go through those, see what people had to say?
Sure, yeah, that would be great. And the ITP and EUA questions are great ones. And actually, I'm really glad that Dr. Nish is on board, because I think the ITP is a little bit of a complicated one. Hopefully he'll be able to help me answer that. But I think we'll be able to address all of the concerns that people had. And I also really appreciate the mention of HIV, because there's a lot of similarities and differences to HIV and COVID. And one of our hopes actually is that the science that has gone into developing the COVID vaccines, or at least some of them, may actually lead us finally to an HIV vaccine. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but certainly that hope is there, because there have been many millions, probably billions of dollars invested in that, but we haven't gotten there yet. But we've learned a lot through COVID, and hopefully it'll transfer over. Yes, what did the poll say?
All right, so we had a poll launched for those who have not been vaccinated. We wanted to hear from you. 12 people responded. Have you had a chance to get vaccinated yet? 9 people said yes. 3 people said no. How willing are you to get vaccinated? 7 said very willing. 1 said somewhat. 1 said a little, and 3 said not at all. How concerned are you about the negative impact of the vaccines? 4 people said very concerned. 2 said somewhat. 3 said a little. And 3 said not at all. And our final question, if you could get vaccinated tomorrow, would you? 7 people said definitely yes. 1 person said likely yes. 2 said likely no. And 2 said definitely no.
Great, thank you. I'm glad to have a range of different thoughts on the vaccine in the audience, as well as willingness and level of concern, and hopefully people will have more clarity and feel less concerned at the end of this. Should we get started?
All right, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, get this presentation up. Bear with me just a moment. All right.
All right, so when we named this talk, or when I named this talk, Everything You Need to Know About the COVID Vaccines, Dr. Nish very wisely said we should add everything you need to know now, because we are just a little bit over a year into when COVID was officially declared a pandemic, and we're learning things every day. And so it is an evolving knowledge, but there is a lot of information that we have now that people can use to make decisions, including the decision about whether or not to get vaccinated. Next slide. It's important in terms of keeping this in perspective that when we look at the history of pandemics, vaccines have almost always been key to bringing them into control. And so this infographic just shows many different pandemics that we've experienced across the world, and the reductions that have been brought about not just by vaccines, but vaccines playing a key role in them, and a key role in the fact that some of these conditions are ones that we don't have to deal with at all now. Next slide. So there's a key question here, and actually I just wanted to stop for a minute and ensure we conveyed the information about translation. Yes? Okay. So I'm going to spend the first part of this discussion talking about how it is that vaccines are tested and how it is that it's determined that a vaccine is safe and effective. And we actually use kind of 2 words that sound similar, but mean slightly different things. So there's efficacy, which relates to the extent to which a vaccine or a new treatment is determined to work and once it's in a clinical trial. And then there's effectiveness, which is really the term most of us are familiar with, which is refers more to how things work in the real world. So the clinical trials really look at efficacy, and I'll get to I'll talk a little bit more about the definition or how we determine both of those on the next slide. So anytime there is a new drug or vaccine that's been developed, there are phases of clinical trials that are conducted to determine whether that vaccine is safe and efficacious. And there are different standards to determine or that need to be met before something gets approved. The standards for a vaccine, especially for safety, tend to be particularly high because we give vaccines, or at least preventative vaccines, we give them to healthy people. So there's a much higher standard for safety than there would be for a treatment that you might give to people who are already sick. And so there might be a different sort of risk-benefit ratio there. As I said, there's 3 phases of clinical trials that happen before something gets to an approval. And that third stage is where we really start to test efficacy or how it works. And in that stage, people are randomly assigned, meaning they're assigned by chance, to either get the vaccine that's being tested or a placebo. A placebo being, it could be a sugar pill if it's a treatment. Generally, with the vaccine, a placebo is something like salt water that looks similar, is given in a similar way so that patients and often their providers don't know which one they got, and you can compare in a fair way whether or not the vaccine works and whether or not it's safe. Next slide. So efficacy, like I said, is how it's determined within the trial that something works. And it's basically defined as a significant difference in disease or the rate of disease between people who got the vaccine and people who got the placebo in that phase 3 trial. Safety is defined as no evidence of serious adverse events and evidence that moderate adverse events related to the vaccine are rare. Next slide. So, as many people know, and as someone asked today, we are at the stage of having 3 vaccines that have emergency use, emergency authorization for use, and they've gone through these stages of approval. And if we could just click through these, Samantha. Thank you. Keep going. So once they have the data from phases 1 to 3, the vaccine developers then share this information with both the Food and Drug Administration and this independent committee called the ACIP, or the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices. These are independent groups, meaning that they're not receiving money from the pharmaceutical companies, they're not benefiting financially or otherwise from whether or not the vaccines are approved. They look to determine how efficacious or how well the vaccines work, how safe they are, and to look at the balance between potential benefits and harms. They also examine how good the evidence is, both overall, but perhaps even within subgroups of individuals to determine whether or not the vaccines would be appropriate for various subgroups. The developers apply for this emergency use authorization, and that's what is the authorization that people get before there's full approval, and when it's determined that the benefits outweigh the risks. And as all of us know, we've been going through this pandemic for over a year now. There have been 600,000 deaths in the US. And so the idea of having an emergency authorization makes sense because of just how serious the pandemic has been, both in our country and in others. What's made many people concerned about the vaccine, and quite reasonably, is how quick it was developed. And it was quicker than what we've seen for vaccines in the past in terms of getting through these 3 stages of clinical trials. So I want to talk a little bit about how it was that the process was sped up in order to hopefully convey why it is that many of us feel confident in the vaccine, even though the process was sped up. So Joanne asked a question that I'm going to look at here before I keep going. You said, could you clarify the term emergency authorization being common stage, right? It could make people, yeah, and I think I'm getting here in terms of whether or not this meant that corners were cut. And the answer is no, corners were not cut, but it was determined that the approval might happen earlier. The corners were not cut, but the approval has happened before these trials were done. The trials are all intended to follow people for 2 years, right? So we know that none of the trials have gone for 2 years yet, but the trials have accumulated enough evidence that waiting would be problematic, that the benefits of getting people vaccinated now are far outweigh the risks. And so I'll talk about this a little bit more. So partly the processes were sped up by conducting some of the phases together. So they didn't skip phases, but in some cases they did phase 1 and 2 together, or phases 2 and 3 together, so that they could simultaneously test different aspects of the vaccine. 2, because the pandemic has been going so fiercely, the difference in the rates of disease between those people who got the vaccine and those people who got the placebo emerged in the data very quickly. It became clear very quickly that one group was at much higher risk of getting infected with COVID than the other. If the rates of disease in the population were lower, you would have to wait longer to see that. Three, part of what happened with Operation Warp Speed and efforts in other countries were that these resources basically increased and made more efficient the whole research process. So there was a huge infusion of money from governments, but also private money. There was greater cooperation across labs, both within our country and across countries. And then there were multiple clinical trials that happened at the same time. And there are still many clinical trials for vaccines that are going on. But the bottom line is that there was a lot of resources that were invested, and there was a lot of sharing of knowledge that otherwise may not have occurred. Instead, people might be competing to try to get there first, but sometimes you can get there faster, right, if you go together. And then finally, the fact that the emergency use authorization basically happened one day, and literally the next week, they were delivering vaccines for the first two that were approved, was because the government basically decided that they were going to help the companies have the resources to actually produce large numbers of vaccines even before the findings of the trial were available. They had enough evidence from the early phases of the trial that the vaccines would likely work and were safe. And the idea was you didn't want to wait after you knew that the vaccines work, then have to wait months to be able to get the vaccines for people. So they made that investment in manufacturing and actually producing the vaccines before the results were available. Now, it could have happened that they got to that stage and realized the vaccine didn't work well enough or wasn't safe, in which case they would have had to basically lose that investment. But that was why the investment was made. Next slide. So hopefully this has helped people understand that fast is not necessarily bad. The times that I've been late getting to my flights at LAX, which maybe is more often than I would like to admit, we drove, at the speed limit or maybe a little bit above, but we didn't run traffic lights, and we didn't, go the wrong way off ramps to get to the airport. So all of the regularly required steps were indeed followed. The criteria for efficacy and safety remained high. And as I said, these criteria are actually higher for vaccines than they would be for treatment for people who are sick. The other really striking thing is that the safety data and the efficacy data and particularly are actually quite strong, and in fact better than many other vaccines that we have, especially in terms of how well these vaccines work. Should be one more point. And then finally, I'd like to convey that the vaccine developers actually had a big start. So even though to us, we saw something that happened in less than a year, there was actually a lot of work that had been going on well before that. Next slide. So in thinking about this, it's really important to remember that the COVID virus, which is also known as SARS-CoV-2, is a member of a coronavirus family that we've known about for many years. There are many different coronaviruses, hundreds in fact. But like one of my students who's kind of presented with me on a few occasions, he talks about, like if you think about any family, there might be members that you don't necessarily want to spend much time with or don't necessarily want to have in your home. There might be one or two members like this, and SARS-CoV-2 and SARS-CoV-1, which was basically what caused the SARS pandemic, are those kind of members of the family that you don't want around. So there were coronaviruses that sparked the SARS pandemic, but that was in 2002, over 18 years ago, as well as the MERS or Middle East Respiratory Syndrome epidemic in 2012. So scientists really from that time have been working on developing a vaccine against a very similar virus. This is just a kind of a timeline that shows some of that work. In fact, there were efforts to, and I'm not going to go through this in detail, but there's a couple of different points to make on this timeline, just how long work has been happening in this area and the diversity of people who've been involved in this effort. So the technology for 2 of the vaccines, mRNA vaccines, which are in Moderna and Pfizer, people have been working on that since the 1990s. As I said, a lot of this work revved up in 2002 with the SARS pandemic, and then there was efforts that continued all the way through today and December when the first emergency use authorization came about. Next slide. You can just see some other timelines here in terms of when Twitter, relative to that, when Twitter and Facebook came to be. So while COVID disease has been with us for over a year, researchers have been working on coronavirus vaccine development since, since COVID. They started with specifically working on development for this vaccine since they first sequenced the virus. But they've been working, if you go to the next, keep going. They've been working on vaccines for similar viruses since 2002 and on mRNA vaccines since the mid-1990s. So as I said, 3 vaccines have been approved for emergency use in the United States. 2 of these are mRNA vaccines, and 1 of these is a viral vector vaccine by Johnson & Johnson. I'm going to talk a little bit about how each of these work, and this is sort of like the geeky part of the presentation. It may be, for some of you, it may be more detailed than you want. For other people, it might be very useful because, in part because there's lots of misinformation out there about how the vaccines work. But I'm just going to spend a little bit of time conveying that. If there's not any questions that I should stop and answer before I do that.
We might have received a couple questions. I think I might have gotten a couple of direct messages, so I'm going to pause you for just a second so that I can see if I've received anything.
Good morning, Bishop Taylor.
I want to use this moment, Dr. Harawa, to apologize for being so late and to thank the gracious Archdeacon Emeritus Joanne for helping organize and Sam for her wonderful duties, keeping things going as always. Good to be with you, my colleagues.
Thank you.
Welcome, welcome. So I have received a couple of questions. This might be something you're going to talk about soon, but EUA is not the same as actual FDA approval, though. Phase 3 and 4 trials are still ongoing. Is that correct?
Yes, the phase 3 trials are supposed to go for 2 years. So as I said, none of them have finished that process. The period at which the pharmaceutical companies could apply for emergency use authorization was after at least half of the participants had gone 2 months past their second vaccine, if there were 2 doses, their second dose. And the main reason for that was enough time to determine if there was a difference in how well the vaccine works between groups, and it was enough time to determine negative effects, side effects, or other negative reactions, because we know that the 95% or more of negative effects to vaccines happen within a month of when they're administered. So they basically said, we're going to double that. You have to have followed at least half of the people in the trials for 2 months before you can apply for this emergency use authorization.
Okay. How will we know how long the protective antibodies last from each vaccine?
Great question. We don't. We'll have a better idea after we have these 2 years worth of data. Part of what they have been doing to get some insight in that now is actually monitoring in some people the antibody response and other immune responses and looking at whether or not that's declining over time. But we won't absolutely know how long it is until we have the time to see that. It's quite possible that people will need to have booster vaccines, and there are boosters being developed both in anticipation of either waning immunity or for the new strains.
Okay. So this same person would like to know which vaccine would be best for someone with ITP and has no spleen and is on blood thinners and atrial fibrillation and other comorbidities. Is that something
Yeah.
you'll be talking about?
That is a very big question. And
Okay.
so we're going to get to the different vaccines, but I'm wondering, do you want to speak to that a little bit now, Dr. Nish?
Certainly, I'd be happy to. To the best of my knowledge, ITP should have no bearing on your selection of vaccines. There are very few absolute contraindications, meaning reasons not to receive a vaccine. And most medical conditions are not contraindications. That's a brief answer, but the ITP one, I've never seen anything that suggests ITP should be a determinant on whether to get vaccine. And the best one for anybody, ITP or otherwise, is the one that you can get. And I'm sure Dr. Harawa will talk about supply problems and distribution problems going forward. And if not, we can discuss that further.
Real quick, what is
Well,
ITP?
ITP is idiopathic thrombocytopenic purpura, which is a problem with platelets and blood clotting. That's why they call it ITP. So you don't have to say idiopathic.
That's a
Got
mouthful.
So yeah, I will speak to this a little bit more though. And I think, my guess is the reason that this question has come about is because there was a case in Florida, I believe it was an OBGYN who got the vaccine and then had a case of ITP and ended up dying. And they have not necessarily said it was because of that, but it's obviously very, very concerning. So I actually this is one where I actually would say this. I actually think you should talk to your doctor about this in particular. There have been a very small number of cases that have occurred following the vaccination. Now, a lot of things occur following vaccination. This is the biggest point I want to make. A lot of things occur following vaccination. A lot of things occur following drinking glasses of water or walking across the street. It doesn't always mean that they are related to the vaccine. But from what I've read, there's some concern that this could be, and it's just not clear whether or not it is. But literally when I say there's been a few cases, I think I've read about like 4 or 5 in the country, whereas there've been, I think now millions of people who've been vaccinated. And I've only know of that one death. But it is a very, I do think it's something we should, it's the one, I think it's the one that I have this, I won't say it's the one, but it's the main one I would say I have some hesitation about
Okay.
that I've heard.
All right. So we've got
I am going to get more to the differences between, or I totally agree with Dr. Nish said, the one you can get is the one to take, but I'm going to talk a little bit more about how they differ and helping people to understand what looks like very different data on how well they work. That's actually not as different as it seems.
Okay. We've got a couple other questions. Ada, if you'll let me know if I'm getting this one right, Padre Roberto asked about how members of the Latino community are concerned about registering for the vaccine because of potential questions about legal status.
Yes.
Ada, correct me if I didn't get that right.
Yeah, no, I'm really glad that question came up. There's no limit on getting the vaccine based on people's legal status. If somebody gets asked that question, I would suggest they refuse to answer. I have heard of a case in a Rite Aid where somebody was asked to give their social security number and later Rite Aid apologized for that. At the county sites and most of the sites I'm aware of, they don't ask that. They don't ask it when you register. There is no tracking of people's legal status related to the vaccination. That information has been, is protected in terms of HIPAA laws, et cetera. But it's a very reasonable concern. I think the other thing I would encourage people to do in Latino communities who are particularly worried about that is to go to providers that they feel more comfortable with. I believe that both, for example, both Altamed and St. John's have been doing vaccine distribution, and look to local clinics that already serve your community or that people may be already going to, that they may have a higher level of trust. Not that people can't go elsewhere, but I'm just suggesting that if you have members of your community who are, if you yourself or you have members of your community that are particularly concerned about that, might feel more comfortable going to those sites.
Okay. Padre Roberto follows up. Ada, again, correct me if I'm not getting this right. I'm not able to get the vaccine because of my age, but other clergy members are considering it. Can I get it, and where should I get it?
Well, I don't know how old you are, but soon, as of April 15th, it should be that everyone 16 and over will have access to get the vaccine. Right. And then I think April 1st, it's age 50 and above. They should have access through like the county, all the county sites.
Okay. And I see Dr. Nish is nodding along with that. Can the vaccine trigger a shingles eruption? I've heard of this happening.
That is one I have not heard about. And I cannot think of a mechanism why it would.
Okay. Why on the registration form do they ask for your gender assigned at birth?
So that's actually in part because of advocacy. There has been an effort to have better data on people's, in general, this is across many different venues, on people's gender identity and sexual orientation. And so one of the ways that we ask about that is gender assigned at birth, or sex assigned at birth, and then people's gender identity right now. And it's basically an effort to better understand, for example, are transgender individuals maybe experiencing, or less likely to get the vaccine, or in terms of like COVID testing data, more likely to get COVID or less likely to get COVID. So there's been an effort to so we can better understand our communities and who needs what.
Okay. And we got one last question. I think you mentioned you were going to touch on this in a little bit. Will the vaccines lower platelet counts, and how much?
Yeah, so like I said, the platelet count issue, there's just been these few cases, there's been these very small number of cases that may or may not be related to the vaccine where people have had these serious drops in platelet counts. It's not something that like is routinely measured, or that you would routinely expect to see that there would be a change in platelet counts related to it.
Okay. So that's the last question I have. So I'm going to share my screen again, and we'll continue with the presentation. And I imagine we'll find another place to pause and take more questions. So, all right, here we go.
Okay, so we're getting into the science. Next slide. So I'm going to talk briefly about each of the two types of vaccines. So as I said, the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines are quite similar to each other. They're both messenger RNA or mRNA vaccines. This infographic shows something about how they work. So the vaccine is injected into your arm and taken up by the cells. The messenger RNA basically is like a little, very small blueprint that tells parts of your cells how to make the spike protein, which is just one small part of the COVID vaccine. The little part that sticks out, like you saw it on an earlier picture, but that kind of sticks out of the surface of the COVID vaccine. Then our own cells start, the few cells that have gotten the mRNA vaccine start expressing that spike protein. Our body's like, oh, this doesn't belong here. We're going to get our immune response together and kill it. So basically, that then it gets killed and basically taken out of our body. So what's left is our body's ability to respond in a more rapid and robust way if our body is exposed to the actual COVID virus. But that mRNA that got injected into us, that small amount, actually doesn't stay into our body because our immune system basically takes care of it and clears it from our body. This technology is different than other vaccines in that other vaccines often will give like give something directly, like already make that spike protein and give it to us. Instead, this vaccine basically gives our body cells the instructions to make the spike protein. And it was partly done, it was a more rapid, and that happened in part because it was a more rapid technology for being able to develop and to get the vaccine, to develop the vaccine and get it out to people. Next slide. So the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is slightly different. It's a viral vector vaccine. It is basically created by taking an adenovirus, which is another type of virus that can also cause symptoms like a common cold, removing the genetics from the adenovirus so it cannot replicate within our bodies, and replacing those genetics with the DNA for that spike protein. So that spike protein, they've known for a long time, is important, and it's the thing that is really going to make our immune system do what it needs to do to protect us against infection. So both vaccines basically use that spike protein, but just in a somewhat different way. So as I said, they take the adenovirus genetics out of the adenovirus, they replace it with the spike protein DNA. Once it's injected into our bodies, it enters our cells, and then our cells then create the messenger RNA. And so now it's basically a couple steps before the messenger RNA vaccine. So basically our cells create the messenger RNA. The messenger RNA now is in those cells, and it gives them the instructions, which talks about a little bit more on the next slide, to make that spike protein. So basically, kind of at this point, a similar thing is going on whether you got the viral vector vaccine, which is Johnson & Johnson, or the mRNA vaccine, which are Pfizer and Moderna, that they basically now translate that mRNA into the spike protein. The spike protein gets expressed on a few of our cells that have basically, taken in either the viral vector or the mRNA. Our immune system says, wait, you don't belong here, starts marshaling a response, gets rid of those cells, but it's only a small portion, right? And our cells are always regenerating themselves. The most important thing is that our immune system now knows exactly what to do if it is exposed to COVID. And it can mount a robust enough response that will basically take care of COVID before it really takes up space in our systems. Are there questions about that? Okay.
We have gotten a couple of questions. Mostly it's about side effects and medication interactions. Do you want to take a
Okay.
quick pause for that?
I'm going to get to those, so I'll
Okay.
keep going then. So what are the benefits of getting vaccinated? So I've given you a bit about how they were developed, how they work. What's the benefit? The main benefit is that will protect you, your family, and your community from getting symptomatic COVID, and most importantly, from getting really sick or dying from COVID. Now, we've heard these different numbers, and they seem quite different about just how well these vaccines work. So Pfizer and Moderna are both estimated in the clinical trials to be about 95% effective in preventing any symptomatic COVID-19. For Johnson & Johnson, it's 66% effective for preventing moderate or severe infection. So those sound a lot different. Like when I first heard it, I was like, I'm glad I actually was able to get the Pfizer vaccine, and I was glad. But the more I learned about it, it's less clear that one is actually better. And I'll explain that a little bit more. All of the vaccines have been shown to be 95% or more effective in preventing COVID-19 hospital admissions. There was just one hospital admission in the Pfizer vaccine trial, and that was somebody who had gotten vaccinated, but they were not all the way. They had not waited it had not been a full 2 weeks when they got exposed and infected with COVID. There were no hospitalizations among people who were vaccinated in any of the other trials. All of the vaccines have been shown to be 100% effective in preventing COVID-19 death. Now, as I said, these vaccines are actually better than a lot of the other things that we have and we use on a regular basis, and we know to be important in preventing mortality. For example, annual flu vaccines are usually only 40 to 60% effective. Over the last 5 years, if you look at annual flu vaccines, the average has been 40% effective. So these are much better than that. And bottom line, all of them are 95% or more effective in preventing hospital admission and death. Now, if we could go to the next slide, and then I'll hopefully maybe address more of the questions. Of course, some of the concerns are about side effects of these vaccines. And you will see in the clinical trials that side effects were reported fairly often. What you see here is just the side effect, the percentage of people who reported side effects among those who got vaccinated. Some are very obvious, local pain. Almost any of us who have an injection are going to have some pain. Some are a little bit more systemic, like myalgia, which is muscle soreness or fatigue. But when they actually compare, if you look at the very bottom line, when they actually look at, well, how much more likely were people to get a negative symptom compared to the placebo, then this frequency was not as great. So about 50% or 46% for Moderna, 36% for Pfizer, 27% for Johnson & Johnson. Most important thing, though, is that these symptoms went away within a day or two. And all of these symptoms or side effects, if people get them at all, are far better than what people would experience if they have symptomatic COVID-19 itself. Next slide. So now people probably still want to know a little bit more about which one of these vaccines is best. And I actually have a great video here about this, but I feel like we're already kind of getting close on time. So I don't know if I want to show it, but I'd like to really encourage people, if it's on the next slide, if people want to link to it themselves. This video is not long at all. I think it's 6 or 7 minutes, but it really does a great job of describing both what I've said already about how the vaccines are tested, but also pointing out that you can't actually compare the vaccines to each other based on the data that we have. Ideally, we would have had data now from a trial where we could compare Johnson & Johnson to Moderna to Pfizer at the same time, but we don't have that data, right? We don't have that sort of information. And the fact is that the trials were done at different points in the pandemic and in different settings. So the Johnson & Johnson trial, for example, was also done in South Africa and in Brazil, or had more people from South Africa, and was also done in Brazil. So in those places, you had the South African variant, you had the Brazil, what they now call the South African and Brazil variant, that really were not an issue when when Pfizer and Moderna were being tested. So if we could test them all side by side today, we might, Johnson & Johnson may actually look much more similar to Pfizer and Moderna. We don't have that kind of side by side comparison. So again, as Dr. Nishi was saying, the best vaccine is the one that you can get. Next slide.
And I'll go ahead and post a link to this video on the convention website as well with the other resources.
Yeah, and maybe if you could put it in the chat too for people. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
So all 3 of the vaccines greatly reduce the chance that somebody's going to get a severe case of COVID and prevent death. We can't, see, this is everything I just said. So we'll keep going to the next one.
All right, let me know when you want to pause for questions. I've gotten a few more.
Yeah. Maybe we should pause here then.
All right, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a moment. Let me just scroll back up here, make sure I didn't miss anything. My daughter does not want me to get the vaccine because it has not been tested for long enough, and there are too many instances of death following the second vaccine. Also, have heard of numerous cases of Bell's palsy side effect.
Yeah. So there, this is where it's always hard to, I think, to get people to understand that, yes, there are deaths following the vaccine. That doesn't mean the deaths were caused by the vaccine. Even when you look at the trial data, when you look at the non-COVID deaths, for example, there were more non-COVID deaths in the people who got the placebo than the people who got the vaccine. The problem is in sort of when things get rolled out and somebody gets a vaccine one day and they have, say, a heart attack or something else that happens the next week, people will assume it's because of the vaccine, when it's quite likely that that would have happened, or I mean, we can never say 100%, but it's quite likely that would have happened. And there are many people who got heart attacks who didn't get the vaccine. The reason why we feel confident, there's two reasons why we feel confident that the deaths are not related to the vaccine. One, we didn't see them happen more commonly in the trials when we actually could compare side by side people who got a placebo to people who got a vaccine. Two, there's ongoing monitoring that happens where they actually look at, are certain kinds of conditions that are happening, that people are experiencing, happening more frequently now in vaccinated populations than we would expect based on prior data or based on data of populations that we can compare to in the general community who are not getting vaccinated. And those are being monitored on a regular basis. There's a whole system for monitoring that. And it's yet to show this signal of some type of increased risk that is occurring among people vaccinated compared to people not vaccinated.
Okay. Next question. I talked with a friend who was concerned that embryos were used in making the vaccine. I hadn't heard of this and didn't have any info to offer.
Yeah, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine was developed from fetal cell lines that were first, not embryos, but that were first developed, I think, in the 70s and 80s. And so there are many generations removed. Those fetal cell lines did come from elective abortions, but like I said, there are many generations removed, and there wasn't embryos, so to speak. I don't think I answered the question about Bell's palsy. Bell's palsy, there's something else that there's been some concern about. It's not been shown yet that it's been definitely related to the COVID vaccine. And one of the other things to keep in mind is that Bell's palsy is a condition that sometimes occurs because of an infection with the virus. So there's also the risk, and probably more of a risk, of getting Bell's palsy following COVID-19 than it is from the vaccine.
Okay.
Do you want to add to that, Dr. Leach?
Yes, I would. Thank you. I was about to pop in, and so it is absolutely true that Bell's palsy and another neurologic condition called Guillain-Barré syndrome can be associated with any viral infection. Specifically, prior Guillain-Barré and or Bell's palsy is not a reason to not get vaccinated. That's actually a specific statement from the CDC. So that would not be a reason to forego the vaccine. And just one other comment to follow up on the question of use of fetal tissues, reemphasizing that the early research was many generations ago, and the Pope has said that past history is not a reason to forego vaccination.
Thank you.
Okay. Have there been other mRNA vaccines before? I don't remember hearing about this technology being used.
No, there haven't. They've been working to develop them, but these are the first, to my knowledge, that have been actually received this type of authorization for use.
Okay. What is your advice for someone who's taking a lot of medications and worried about interactions?
There's no evidence that vaccinations in general or that these vaccines interact with medications. So I wouldn't, that would not be something that would make me hesitate at all.
Okay. I got a question about if the session is recorded. It is recorded and the link will be available for viewing later. Just a quick reminder for everyone. Has any data emerged about the effectiveness of the vaccine in the immunodeficient?
I have not read data like maybe specific to that. So there were some populations that were immunodeficient in the trials, including people living with HIV, people who were transplant recipients. I don't know that I've read data that specifically breaks out how well it worked for them, but it's certainly considered, if anything, highly recommended for somebody in that situation because you have a greater chance of a negative outcome if one were to get COVID.
Okay.
Sam,
Could you?
if I might
Yes.
answer, I think Jamie asked in the early stages of questions about people and blood transfusions, and there is no there is no blood products in the vaccine, and therefore people who are hesitant for receiving transfusion should not be hesitant about receiving vaccines. So there is no blood serum or anything like that involved in the vaccines. So that should not be a reason to forego vaccines, COVID vaccines.
Okay. Could you discuss more about the ways in which mRNA vaccines might be a model for protection against other illnesses?
I don't know if I could, I don't know that I can actually. I just know that it's a technology that they've been working on and for whatever reason have not been, have not been able to use yet or, successfully. Part of like I said, they were working on similar vaccines for SARS and MERS, but those epidemics also came under control before we needed a vaccine, right? But actually, I don't know that I can answer your question on that one.
Okay.
In terms of a model.
This one is from Bishop Taylor. We're in this time of being, one, hyper-informed, and two, whipsawed by clashing cultural and political narratives that inevitably influence public health matters. There was already a lot of weirdness in the culture about vaccines, both on the left and the right. How can the average person best inform themselves in these times?
Yeah, I have some additional resources at the end. I partly myself and a lot of other of my colleagues have been doing talks like this because I think even though there's a lot out there, it's very easy to get overwhelmed. So I feel like having somebody who can present it and then answer questions like this is probably invaluable for many people. Some of the resources I have at the end I think are useful if people want to go back and read and learn more, and Samantha's posted some additional ones. The main thing I would say is to stick to trusted sources. CDC, WebMD, Healthline. Stick to trusted sources because unfortunately there's a lot of bad information out there.
Okay. I have a friend in his 70s who works at home, really doesn't interact closely with anyone. He believes he doesn't need to get the vaccine unless he's taking a trip to visit family out of town. Should he get it now anyway?
Great question. I think ideally should. I think it's, but I do respect that it's a personal decision that all of us have. Even if he lives at home, I'm assuming he goes to the store or the post office. And not only, is COVID still out there, there also are strains that are now transmit more easily. So he is at some risk. I would strongly encourage, though, for anyone, if you listen to this or something else and somebody strongly still does not want to get the vaccine, that you do everything you can to protect yourself and others. And those are all the things that, we've been hearing about for months already. But, just the fact that somebody works at home to me doesn't mean that they don't have any chance of getting infected.
Okay. And that actually leads into the next question. Because of the new strains, should people who have completed the 2-shot regimen also get the Johnson & Johnson,
No.
especially those with multiple comorbidities?
No, because we don't know how well those work together. We don't know that that it would be safe to do them both. There's been no testing of that. The good thing though is that all of there's some efficacy. We know there's some efficacy for all of the vaccines against the new strains. They may not work as well, but there's some evidence that they do hold some benefit. The other good news is that Pfizer, Moderna are working on boosters that should be effective against the new strain, so that there may be something down the line that people can get for that reason.
All right. Yes, please.
Well, I was gonna say, I feel like there are a few more slides that I feel like I should get through it, but
Okay, let me just zip through this. Someone else was asking about an elderly friend who doesn't go anywhere. Should they get vaccinated? Same answer, I would imagine. Thank you. Good to hear an endorsement of WebMD, which a lot of people use. And just someone wanted to clarify on the fetal cell tissue. Is fetal cell tissue actually in the Johnson & Johnson vaccine?
no.
I see Dr. Nish is no. No fetal cell tissue in the vaccine itself. Okay.
Yeah,
Sandy-
specifically what I said is the technology was developed from fetal cell lines. No fetal cell tissue was used
Sam-
in development, or is it in the vaccine?
Okay.
Sam, if I might respond a little bit further to Bishop Taylor's inquiry about how to sift all this out. The data are emerging on a almost daily basis, and questions such as the one that just was asked about, do you get a second vaccine? Rely on the people who can do science. Some of the questions regarding should you get the J&J vaccine, those are things that are actively being pursued. And just because something is coincident does not mean cause and effect. And so know that, and you can see the scientists at work when you see, and people concerned about rapid rollout. Notice that the AstraZeneca vaccine, which we haven't really talked about, hasn't even applied for emergency use authorization, but has been in other countries. And it has been slowed up. Dr. Fauci this week said something about the concerns and why it's being delayed or being studied more fully, but even the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, but AstraZeneca in specific. The monitoring goes on, and that's why it hasn't been receiving full FDA approval, because the monitoring continues, as Dr. Harawa had said previously. And so stay tuned. The reason for the asterisk and the update to the title for this presentation was what we know today is different than what we knew last week or earlier this week even. So trusted sources, CDC, FDA, they're cautious people. When they give full-throated endorsement and approval, that's based on intensive study. And those are trusted sources in my professional view. So stay tuned, always stay tuned.
All right. I'll go ahead and share my screen again. We'll get to those last few slides. Where were we?
Yeah, that's one.
This one? Okay.
That was it. So generally you won't be able to choose, and that's largely because the supply is limited and different places often will only have one option anyway. There are some other differences. The Pfizer vaccine was tested on people as young as 16. So at some point, 16 to 18-year-olds will be able to take it. Pfizer, Moderna have differences in terms of how far apart you take them. the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is only 1 dose. And so, you know, where people get the full immune response is going to be somewhat longer or shorter. And, you know, this, if somebody really had a choice and say they had to go see their mother who was in their 90s, you know, across country in a month, then I would take Johnson & Johnson, because you're going to get to your immunity quickest. But otherwise, I think there's very little reason to worry about which one to take. Next slide. And and another point too about Johnson & Johnson is it seems to show this sort of growing effectiveness. So like I think you're considered fully immunized after 2 or 3 weeks, but after about 28 days, you actually have higher effectiveness than you would earlier on. So just to address some of the other questions that people might have, often people are concerned, was the vaccine tested on someone like them? And I could almost definitely say yes. There were over 100,000 people who participated in the trials for these 3 vaccines. All of them had adults who were between 18 and 95. Johnson & Johnson had people up to age 100. There was a lot of diversity in terms of race, ethnicity. Vaccines were tested not just in the US, but in other countries as well. For the mRNA vaccines, the efficacy was similar across race ethnicities. For people with chronic conditions, it was very slightly less, but still highly efficacious. They were also tested among people who had previously had COVID-19. And that's another question people sometimes ask. If you've had COVID-19, should you get vaccinated? And the answer is yes, you should still get vaccinated. Some people, there's some recommendations that you should wait 60 days, 90 days, but it's not really clear whether or not you should, how long you should wait or whether you should wait, but you definitely don't want to take it while you're recovering from COVID-19, while you're still sick. So that would be a question. If I had had COVID, I would ask in terms of waiting, but if I were anywhere after 2 months, definitely go ahead and get vaccinated. Next slide. Yes, it's important to still, so do I still need to wear a mask after getting vaccinated? Yes, and for a couple of reasons. The vaccines protect against moderate and severe disease. In particular, they might not protect, they don't protect as well against mild infections or symptom-free infections. So it's still possible that somebody can get COVID-19 and pass it to others. We know it's less likely, but it's possible. And then I would just, argue, and I only put this on this talk because we're, talking as an Episcopal community, that there's also a moral imperative here. If you're going out, you're interacting with service people, they don't necessarily know whether you've been vaccinated or not. It's not fair to be like, oh, I'm not vaccinated, so I don't have to. I can just expose these other people. People who provide us services shouldn't have to worry about whether or not we're telling the truth, whether or not we're fully vaccinated, etc. So we've talked about this. Should you get vaccinated even if you have other chronic conditions? And the answer to this is almost always yes. And particularly for the conditions that I've listed here, things like diabetes, heart disease, cancers, liver disease. There were hundreds of people in the trials with each of these conditions, and they did not experience worse side effects than others, and the vaccines worked similarly well for them. And so it's probably even more important that people with these conditions, it is even more important that people with these conditions get vaccinated, because many of them lead to worse COVID outcomes, and there's no evidence that the vaccine is going to cause problems, particularly for those individuals. Now, there are, some maybe particularly rare conditions, some people with severe histories of severe allergic reactions in particular, that I would encourage people to talk to their doctor before they got vaccinated. But for the vast majority of underlying conditions that people might have, yes, the vaccine should be something that's considered safe for you. Next slide, we can keep going. So we've talked a lot about this in terms of the new mutations. The vaccine, there are these 3 major variants that we're concerned about now, the UK, Brazil, and South African variant. Pfizer and Moderna appear to work similarly well against the UK variant, but much less well against the South African variant. Johnson & Johnson works similarly well against the Brazilian variant, but somewhat less well against the variant from South Africa. And actually, I realize we probably shouldn't name these after countries because there's issues with that, but the numbers, naming by the numbers is also hard for me. You shouldn't get charged for the vaccines. The vaccines themselves, the cost has been covered by tax dollars. It's possible if you go to your private doctor that they might charge you for administering it, but at like the pods and the public sites, there's no charge at all. You won't get charged on the spot or later for the vaccinations. Yeah, I already said this, we'll keep going. So this slide just summarizes and to hopefully help people keep in mind that we really have to keep in mind this risk benefit idea. Probably no medical advance is 100% without any risks. Yes, there are sometimes people who have had mild side effects are fairly common. For every million people who've been vaccinated, there have been 2 to 3 serious reactions, 1 to 2 hospitalizations. And there have been there's very, very small number of deaths that have occurred, but none of them have been definitively associated with the vaccine. And we can compare this to the fact that for every million cases of COVID-19 infection, there's 15,000 deaths and 70,000 hospitalizations. And I'm sorry, I'll just show at the bottom. Can you go to the last slide again? If you go back.
Sorry, it doesn't want to cooperate with me. Here we go.
Oh, so if you look at the bottom of the slide, Moderna and Pfizer vaccine each reported 10 serious allergic reactions out of 4 million doses that had been given. And so there's the monitoring that happened during the clinical trials and afterwards that gives us the confidence in terms of how rare these few serious events that have happened are. Next slide. There's also other risks associated with COVID that I think people don't think about enough. I think some people feel like, well, I'm fairly young, I'm fairly healthy. Even if I got COVID, I wouldn't die, I wouldn't get hospitalized. That may or may not be true, but we know that a lot of people have these long-lasting symptoms. I have a postdoctoral fellow I worked with who was infected in February and still can't smell anything. And there was a family that got at risk, like I think had a risk from a gas leak because they couldn't smell the gas leak. And so, that sounds like maybe one of the more minor side effects, but it's actually can be a fairly serious one. And many people have much more serious side effects, difficulty thinking, concentrating, depression, long-term muscle aches. And we're learning more and more about these long-term effects that people have, even previously healthy, fairly young people have from COVID-19. So we have to realize it's not just about concerns related to death or hospitalization. Next slide. There are some other benefits to the vaccine. I'll say personally, for me, before when I would go grocery shopping, I'd be careful, but almost every time I would be like, should I just start ordering my groceries online? Because I always thought there was some point where people got too close to me, where people were wearing their masks like this, something else. And now when I go out, I don't worry. I still take my precautions, but it's just nice to have that relief of not to worry. So, recently CDC has updated its guidance. They said if you're visiting with other people who are fully vaccinated, you can do so indoors without masks or physical distancing. That's with other people who are fully vaccinated. They also say if you're visiting from with unvaccinated people from a single household, and those people are at low risk, those individuals are low risk for COVID-19, you can do so without masks or physical distancing. Of course, safest is to keep that on, but it's considered okay to not do so. And you can refrain from quarantining and testing following a known exposure, assuming you're asymptomatic. So there's some real advantages just in terms of day-to-day life if you're vaccinated. But remember that fully vaccinated is not right after the first shot or the second shot. It's 2 weeks after the second dose in the 2-dose series for Pfizer, Moderna, and 2 weeks after the first dose for Johnson & Johnson. But for me, for Johnson & Johnson, I would wait 4 weeks because the immunity actually really improves over that subsequent 2 weeks. And so you're much more protected at 28 days than you are at 14 days post Johnson & Johnson. Next slide. Oh. So just, I think one of the other benefits of vaccination is that most of us would like to get back to something, maybe not our old normal, but something that looks a lot more like it. And that really depends on as many of us getting vaccinated as possible. There's this concept called herd immunity, which basically means that even if you're a susceptible individual, if you're with a group of people where most people are immune, then you inherit this immunity from the group. So if you look at the right side of this infographic, the people who are in blue who are susceptible, they still are unlikely to get infected because the disease's chances are it's going to die out before it gets to them. Because it's going to, the virus, whatever it is going to keep encountering people who are immune and die out before it gets to someone who's not immune. So that's the level we want to get to, but that means getting about 70% of our populations vaccinated. So part of the other important thing to keep in mind here, and this is the second bullet on this slide, some people, there's this, for many kind of around many vaccinations, there's this idea that, well, maybe natural immunity is better, that it's better if we just let nature take its course. But we actually have more and more data that actually vaccine immunity is probably better, more effective. Here's just one example. There was a study looking at the Moderna vaccine, and it found that 4 months after people had received the first dose of the Moderna vaccine, they actually had a stronger antibody response than people who had recovered from COVID just 3 to 6 weeks before. So we're seeing evidence that this vaccine response for Moderna lasts longer and is stronger than the immune response that you would have from actually having the infection itself. So just some takeaways about the vaccines themselves, and then I'll talk a little bit more about actually getting an appointment. The vaccines work and are safe, but nothing is 100% safe. I would really encourage people where they're possible in their communities. There's, 20 people on this call now. So, where I think the impact of this work is how you share it with other people. Because there's so much misinformation out there, please be a source of good information. Despite all the misinformation that's out there, COVID really doesn't care what we believe. It doesn't care if we're Republicans or Democrats or think that the virus was a hoax or that it's like the flu. It can still cause serious problems from us. And the side effects of contracting the disease are well documented to be far worse than getting the vaccine itself. Next slide. Oh yeah, thank you for I forgot about this at the bottom. And just to remind us, even though things are so much better than they were just 2 months ago, COVID is still very much an issue. In the time of this presentation, about 44 Americans have died of COVID-19 and 200 were hospitalized. And even though cases in California are going down, I heard just this week that there's 18 states where cases are going up. So we're still a good ways from being on the other side of this pandemic. The main reason to consider taking the vaccine is because millions of people have died or were hospitalized with COVID. The vaccines are similar and work extremely well, particularly at preventing COVID hospitalization and death. And getting vaccinated protects not just you, but helps to protect your community. Next slide. So just how does one get the vaccine? Now, I don't know how many people have tried, but I do know that it can be challenging to get vaccinated. Right now, we're in phase 1B, which means that the people in the green part of this slide are eligible to get vaccinated. That includes people 65 and older, and people who work in certain industries, including things like emergency services, food and agriculture, janitorial services, etc. This is going to broaden very soon. We're close to the end of March, and April 1st, people ages 50 and older will be able to get vaccinated. And the target is that April 15th, that's going to go down to 16 and older. The website for getting a vaccine appointment is vaccinatelacounty.gov. One can also call, there's a hotline here that one can call to get vaccinated. But I would also consider people go to their own providers, like Kaiser has opened vaccination, up to its patients. Many different healthcare systems, one can get vaccinated that way. But I know, and I don't know how many people have tried to get, gone to these websites. I did try for a friend several weeks ago and spent like hours, going through and being told after putting her information in several different ways and being told at the end that there were no vaccines available. So unfortunately, this does take patience. I think there's various strategies that people use, doing it early in the morning, late at night, when there might be fewer people online, trying repeatedly. The other thing is that there are some places that will work more on walk-ins. So for example, Kedron in South LA, they kind of purposely have been really working to serve people in their community, many of whom don't have regular, maybe as much internet access. And so they have a certain number of appointments they give online, and the rest is based on walk-ins. And so I don't know. I think there's many strategies. I think people could share online if they've had strategies that have worked for them. But I realize that we have a system that doesn't work as well as it should. But I would encourage people to be persistent. The other main thing I've heard for just going through the county is that persistence is the main thing that works if you hit roadblocks. Hopefully it's gotten better too. Next slide. I just wanted to also take a few minutes talking about vaccine equity. This is one of the things that's been really disturbing to me and many others. If you look at the left of this slide, you will see that both parts of this slide, you'll see that the hardest hit areas, which are shown in blue, actually have the lowest vaccination rates. And there's been a lot of reasons for this, but unfortunately, there's some of it has been poor distribution, but some of it has been gaming of the system, where you have people with more access to resources, basically kind of jumping in the front of the line. So I would really encourage people not to do that, and to work to support people who may have more trouble to be able to get vaccinated, to either get an appointment or get to an appointment. Next slide. So I took the liberty, and Bishop Taylor or one of our clergy can also speak more to this, but I talked here about, what would Jesus do in terms of vaccine access? And I would argue that Jesus would share good information from trusted sources. He would not game the system, jump in line, or otherwise use power influence to get vaccinated. And unfortunately, there's lots of examples of people who've done that. That he would help other people who are eligible to get an appointment or get to an appointment. If you don't have a car, it's hard to get to Dodger Stadium and spend, time getting an appointment, for example. And then when you do have the opportunity to get vaccinated, if you make an appointment, show up, because some of these vaccines, once they open them, they've got to use them that day. So not showing up may mean that it goes to waste. And I had to go through my own moral dilemma, I'll say, because I actually got the opportunity to be vaccinated very early, and I actually didn't feel like I'm not at particularly high risk. And after spending time emailing people in my institution at that, kind of the answer I got was, the systems aren't perfect. If I didn't get vaccinated, then it would not necessarily go to somebody who's more needy. So when you get your turn, if you want to get vaccinated, take it. But don't try to get ahead of your turn. And then here are some of those resources that I talked about. I think we've shared most of these before, but there's some nice, there's some nice like fact sheets, etc., that are very simple and direct, addressing COVID. And I would always encourage people, CDC, I think has great information. They're not maybe as, maybe graphic friendly as others, but I think they have great information, and I would always encourage people to go there. And I think, was that my last slide? Oh, and then this is my parting shot. This is me getting vaccinated at UCLA a few months ago. I was lucky that I had no symptoms the first shot and fairly minor symptoms after the second shot. And I just wanted to also take a moment and to kind of dedicate this talk, and I didn't include a picture of her, but to my sister. I have a sister who passed away 11 years ago today. And she died of cervical cancer, which is a whole nother disease, but it's also a disease that's preventable through vaccination. Vaccination with HPV was not something that would have worked for her at the time, or was available to her at the time that she would have been at risk. But it's another public health, I think. HPV in some ways is a public health failure, in the sense that only half the people who should be getting HPV vaccines get it. And so if you have, if you are a young person, or if you have a young person in that eligibility to get HPV vaccine, I would really encourage you to do so, because it prevents not only cervical cancer, but several other types of cancers. And so, just in honor of my sister, Bernadette Harawa, I'll close out and take any other questions.
All right, we've gotten a few things.
Sam,
yeah.
I've been watching the chat, and perhaps I can address some of them in a general fashion. And while I'm doing that, maybe you can scan the rest of them.
Okay.
And add a couple of comments about continuing to mask beyond the time that you have been vaccinated. Air travel is safer than it has been, but if I were traveling, I personally am not anxious about air travel as much as I would love to travel. But I think there are a couple of reasons to continue to mask. One is you don't know the status of the people who are in that same plane as you are. And it continues to model good behavior, even if you've been fully vaccinated. You don't have the ability, nor should you put yourself at risk by asking your fellow passengers or passersby in the grocery store, are you vaccinated? And even if you did that, to be able to expect an honest response in this time, again, reflecting on the comments Bishop Taylor made earlier on. So it continues to demonstrate and model good behavior on a global sense, even beyond COVID. Furthermore, by getting vaccinated and reducing the chance of spread, those people who are concerned about the development of variants and new strains develop because of replication of the virus. And if you get vaccinated, if you interrupt the spread, you are helping to reduce the number of times that viruses can replicate and reducing the risk of developing variants and perhaps reducing the need for booster doses, although I do think that there may be booster doses down the road. But modeling good behavior, reducing the number of variants are moral responsibilities, to use Dr. Harawa's words, to try and help global health, not just your own individual health, your individual family exposures, your congregational exposures, but this is international health on an individual basis. And if you talk about what would Jesus do, Jesus would applaud, in my opinion, things that you can do individually that help not only yourself, but all of those that you care about around you in your community, however you want to define your community. So I hope that answered a couple of different questions that came up. And I don't apologize for the preaching, because I think that's what we're all responsible for doing. Thanks for smiling, Jamie.
Yeah, I agree. And I think I want to just highlight, I think that one of the questions I keep getting lately is about the strains. And I think some people feel like, well, I should wait because there's these new strains and maybe something will come out for those strains. And I think we can't emphasize enough that getting vaccinated now is going to lower the risk of those strains or other strains. And if there is something that comes out in the future that helps with the new strains, either these or others, you should have you will, chances are, have the chance to get that as well. Having gotten vaccinated now is not going to mean you can't have options in the future.
And one other option as far as accessing vaccines, there are some providers who are having waiting lists so that if they come to near the end of the day and they have reconstituted or thawed vaccine, I believe my own brother fell into that category, that he put himself on a waiting list and got a late afternoon call saying, can you be here in 30 minutes? So that is another option. It's not universally available, but it is something that is an option that people have been taking. And that's not jumping the line. That is saving doses from going unused because multi-dose vials have to be used within a certain time frame. And so there are providers that are accumulating waiting lists. Sometimes it's hours, sometimes it's days, sometimes it doesn't happen, but it is another option.
All right. Thank you so much. So we've got several questions. If I happen to miss yours, please do email me after the presentation and I'll get answers for you. But we have quite a bit, so I want to scan through this. Do you have latest safety information for those who are under 16?
No, those trials are ongoing, and they're also starting trials for people even younger than that. I heard yesterday we're going down to 6 months, but I have not seen, I don't think they've published results from the trials for ages 12 to 16 or 12 to 15.
And particularly the data for children between 6 months and 6 years is going to take quite a while to develop. So even the 6 years to 16 years is probably months away.
Okay. All right. Jamie says my cousin Emma is 108 years old today and has had both vaccinations. That's awesome. Deacon Joanne, my dad is 103 and he's also had both vaccines with no side effects. Remember, the effects of COVID-19 infection are much worse in people who get ill rather than the side effects of the vaccine. I have had the Pfizer vaccine and I haven't seen my only child in 15 months. What's your feeling about a flight of several hours in a few weeks? He's also been vaccinated and is very careful.
Yeah, I think this is part of what Dr. Nish was responding to, in that flying is safer. Now there's more and more precautions being taken. I think, connection is also important to our health. So yes, I would think that it would be the fact that both you've been vaccinated and your son's been vaccinated. Take care of yourself by going to see him. But yeah, keep those precautions on the flight.
What about any
and
recommendations?
and in the airports? Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. How about recommendations for people who have received both vaccines and are around children?
Well, so this part depends on which children you're around, right? If you're around, I think in general, in our own households, we're not wearing masks and we're, sort of maybe not having the same level of concern. But if somebody's around other children or taking care of children, I would still follow the same precautions in terms of masking and limiting, the amount of contact, washing hands, etc.
Okay. And you were talking about how fully vaccinated people can visit with other fully vaccinated people. Someone says, sounds like fully vaccinated clergy can do pastoral visits with fully vaccinated parishioners.
Yep.
Yeah. Putting the links on the diocesan resource list. Yes, as a reminder, the recording to this session will be posted, and also links to all the resources that have been posted. That will all be on the convention website. I'll make sure it gets on the diocesan website as well. Someone's off. Yes.
I
I'm
didn't
sorry.
see any questions about pregnancy, but this is something that's come up before. And, I think there's been some conflicting advice over time, but more and more just so people know, there is the consensus that if someone is pregnant, it probably is recommended. It is recommended to get vaccinated, especially if they have, or in a profession or otherwise where they have some risk. Would still make sense to talk to your doctor about it, but there's more and more evidence that it's safe and that the immunity is passed from parent to child. In
Okay.
pregnancy.
And there were women who didn't know they were pregnant who were included in the studies, and there were no identified side effects that I'm aware of.
That's correct.
All right. How long does the virus last on surfaces?
Oh, that all depends on the surface, and I don't remember the details anymore, but it depends on the surface.
Okay.
It's so funny. I used that. That it's anywhere from a few hours to about 24 hours, if I remember right.
Well, the primary mode of transmission is airborne droplets.
That's true too.
Okay. Why does the CDC say if fully vaccinated people don't need to wear a mask, but also after being fully vaccinated, you can still pass on and catch the virus?
They don't say fully vaccinated people don't need to wear a mask. They say that, they talk about if you're like with people from a single household if you're vaccinated and you're with unvaccinated people from a single household who are low risk, then you can forego a mask. And so I think they're arguing there that there's less risk, and there's kind of that balance of people's desire for contact and closeness with the potential transmission risk. But they certainly, CDC has not said not to wear masks.
Okay. Are there drive-through vaccine sites where you don't have to get out of your car?
Yeah, a lot of them are drive-through sites. I mean, the Dodgers Stadium, the Forum, there's many different drive-through sites. And when you go online, it will indicate whether it's only drive-through or walk-up, what the options are.
Okay. My young nieces and nephews, can't wait to visit them. That's wonderful. They are in
That's
preschool
important.
though, so I still worry.
Yeah, I mean, I think, right, we also worry, but I really feel like again, I feel like human contact is important. That's a benefit. One of the benefits of being vaccinated. So, both, you still exercise caution, but, allowing some of that is beneficial both to you and to your nieces and nephews. So.
Okay. A couple of tips. Sunday seems to be a good day to get through for an appointment online. And if you get a Dropbox question about your profession and you're retired, you can go to the bottom and say other, and it'll speed up the process for getting an appointment. Apparently, President Biden has ordered that masks be required on planes and in airports.
Yeah, any like federal federal transportation. Yeah, trains,
TSA.
planes. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's about it. If there's anything that I've missed, if you've asked me a question and I happen to scroll past it, please do email me at swiley@ladiocese.org. As a reminder, the recording for this presentation will be posted on the convention website, along with the slides, along with all of the very helpful links. Thank you so much, Dr. Harawa. Thank you so much, Dr. Nishibayashi. Thank you so much, Dr. Joanne Leslie. And thank you everyone for joining us this morning. It has been a pleasure to have you. and we hope you have a great day.
And I want to say thanks to our interpreter, and I don't think I did a good job of not speaking quickly, but I really appreciate it. I know it's not an easy job, so thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Ada. You are absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much for your help today. All
Stay
right.
safe, everyone.
Yes.